The worst things in the world. All right. Okay. Before we start, are there any questions anyone had from last week, whether about the material or even just anything you've just been thinking of or have come across that you're curious about? Anything?
I'm curious
Yeah.
about how you retain all of that and that knowledge of yours between your ears.
Yeah. Yeah.
He keeps his hair shorter than me.
That helps, yeah.
I love it all, but I'm
Yeah.
like, I wish I could remember it.
Well, yeah, part of it is this is the 6th time I'm teaching the class, so it's getting a little easier. And then also, before I come teach it, I rewatch my old videos, recordings, like many times throughout the week. So that helps too. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question about that word you used, teleonomy or whatever.
Sure, yeah, teleonomy, yeah.
So is that in the dictionary?
I mean, it is a real word. It would certainly be found, in like biology textbooks. Is every word in a biology textbook also in the dictionary? Like, probably not. I would think like some very domain-specific words probably aren't. But it is a real word that they do use in biology. So in Scrabble, in Scrabble would be legit. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah.
That word just blew me away because I'm thinking there are so many words that university students use. I have a niece that's a professor at UBC. She used to say words and it's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
explain the word to me.
Yeah, right.
I don't even know what she's talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. But no, yeah, teleonomy, that is a real word. Good. Anything else?
Ryan, have you got, are we going to deal with a total of 9 proofs for the existence?
Yeah, 9, or we might even do 10. I realized I could kind of, what was that? I keep adding, yeah. I was going to do 9, maybe there was going to be 10 after tonight. So I realized there was another one I could kind of throw in at the start here. So yeah, we did 5 last week and then maybe 4 or 5 this week. So, but yeah, if there's nothing else, I suppose we could jump in. And the first one I thought we'd look at is, kind of connects us to where we were, finished off last class. So this is going to be the argument from free will. Okay, so now this is actually kind of going to combine the latter two that we looked at last class, which was sort of the argument from the nature of forces and the argument from morality. And so the kind of construction of this is going to actually be identical to the argument from morality. So if you remember that one, if free will exists, then there is a God. Premise 2, free will exists. Conclusion, there is a God. So literally exactly the same as the argument from morality, just with the words morality switched with free will. And there's so many things, I've kind of mentioned this a couple of times, so many things that the sort of the skeptic worldview takes for granted in terms of just sort of assuming that we all know is true and then just not thinking about it. So I had mentioned the idea that the universe is comprehensible, right? We all take this for granted. Of course it's comprehensible. We don't think anything of it. But I mentioned, like Einstein, Descartes, right? Like people do ask this. Why is it comprehensible? It doesn't make sense that we should be able to comprehend the universe. And like morality, people just take it for granted, but they believe in God or not. They just assume morality exists, and we all know that because, like as I mentioned from C.S. Lewis, to really believe morality doesn't exist is not a livable position. And this is yet another one. The idea that we have free will, like we basically all assume that we have free will. We can choose. We all presumably chose to be here tonight, right? You don't consider that you literally had no agency over that decision. That somehow the chemicals in your brain inexorably forced you to be here and there was nothing you could have done to prevent it, right? We don't perceive us to be that kind of being. We perceive that we have free will. But again, right, like we saw with morality, the strict naturalist, person who believes that the physical world is all there is and that's all there is to it, does not believe actually that free will exists. If they're being honest, they don't. If they're kind of deceiving themselves, they may say that it's true. But I've met people who are strict naturalists who do not believe they have free will. And there are some prominent scientists and philosophers that also think they do not have free will. And so notice this is the exact same thing we saw with the morality argument. Now, why don't they think we have free will? Well, it's basically the same as morality, right? How would free will have emerged from purely deterministic naturalist processes of evolution, right? Because chemicals don't have free will. So if chemicals coalesced into single-celled organisms, well, those don't have free will, right? So where in the evolutionary chain did free will come from, right? Was it jellyfish, like chipmunks? Like how far do you have to go before you transform from just, biological organism to free will agent? And the naturalist says there is no such place, just like with morality. There is no such place where free will emerges. And so they think that just like a bucket full of chemicals, that our brain is just a very sophisticated container of chemicals, and all the things we do and say and believe are purely deterministic, that we have no choice but to do all the things that we do and say the things we say and believe the things we believe. Now, again, like with morality, this to me feels unlivable, right? Because, so for example, there's an atheist, you may have heard of him, named Sam Harris, very sort of prominent atheist these days, who does not believe we have free will. But he goes on, shows and debates, debating this fact. But how can this make any sense? So he's deterministically debating something that he has no ability to change his mind about or change anyone else's mind about, other than through purely determinist processes. Like, that's bizarre. If he really thinks that, that's really weird. Because that really means that no one can intelligibly agree with him. Right? No matter what the strength of his argument, they can't actually agree with him other than just by the inexorable force of chemical reactions in their brain. Okay? So say some naturalists do believe free will exists. I think, again, it's an unlivable position. But for anyone who doesn't believe in God, but does believe free will, which again is probably, the vast majority of people who don't believe in God still probably believe they have free will. Well, they can ask them, where in the evolutionary chain that is, purely naturalist process, if they don't believe in God, where did free will emerge and how? Right? They'd have to explain how deterministic processes gave rise to non-determinism, right? Chemical reactions gave rise to the ability to make free will decisions. They'd have to explain how that's possible without God. And like we saw with morality, it's not possible. There's no explanation for it. So again, the pure naturalist is living in an untenable position. The skeptic who doesn't believe in God is basically living in an unexamined position because they're believing something that's contradictory. And so again, I think we conclude, again, just like with morality, if we believe we have free will, the only explanation is there is a God. And that's, again, so almost the exact same argument, but just looking at it from a different angle. Any questions about this one? All good. Okay. This is going to lead us into something that's related, although it's going to use a different form now. So this, oh, yes, that's okay.
I'm thinking that predestination.
Aha. Okay.
Kind of like if
Right. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Well, please don't hesitate. If you want to say things, go ahead. I mean, yeah. Right. Very good point. So there's a couple different ways to look at it. So when I have talked to my very strict Calvinist friends, who of course believe in predestination, they say that their belief about free will only applies to salvation, that in every other aspect, they think we do have free will. So I think this is not really applying to like someone who believes in Calvinism or predestination in the same way, because they don't think we don't have free will, except in one very particular case. It was very specialized. I do think, I mean, just on that point, I do think it's a very, I mean, obviously there are verses in the Bible that say some degree that, for God has foreknown us and forechosen us, et cetera, et cetera. So this obviously means something, and it means something important, I'm sure. But I think it can't quite mean what the sort of Calvinist or predestination person believes. And we can demonstrate this, I think, with the counterexample. So let's imagine that we have no free will over that decision. And then someone were to, let's say, give up their faith. Okay, at some point, let's say they're Christian, and then something happened, like I mentioned a couple times, right? The worship pastor or whatever who went to Uganda and saw slavery. Well, if he died before he went to Uganda, he never would have given up his slavery or given up his faith because of, I'm sorry, not slavery, suffering, right? Suffering in Uganda. So if he died, maybe on the plane ride over there, the plane crashed and he died. Well, is he a Christian or not? Like, is he going to heaven or not? Well, if he's really predestined, it shouldn't matter whether he arrived in Uganda or not, right? It was all preordained. So him being there wouldn't matter or not. He either was or wasn't. But now we really have no security one way or another in our faith, right? Because if it's really preordained, then right now we may believe, but God may know that in 10 years' time, some of us may actually abandon our faith. So even now, right now, we're not saved because God knows what would happen. And similarly, what if a baby dies before, or a child or a youth or even an adult before they would have believed? Well, even though they didn't believe, maybe they hated God, but God knows that if they were to have survived, then they would then believe. Well, then, so the whole time they didn't believe in God, are they still saved? I mean, maybe, but I think this really makes it difficult to have any security in your faith because you don't know what God knows that would have happened, even if it doesn't actually happen, right? We sort of talked about this God's middle knowledge, or if we haven't talked about it, it's coming. Right? The idea that God knows not only what has happened, what will happen, and also what would happen if certain events were different. So I just think it's a really, really hard belief to understand logically, given that it doesn't give us any security in our personal salvation. And it has no reflection on what a person believes or ascribes to at any given moment. Now, that's not to say that it can't be true, okay? But I think it's essentially impossible to be logically argued. Right? Now, again, that doesn't mean God has to do everything logically, right? So it's not to say that it's wrong, but I think it's one of those things that's very hard to argue logically. There's just too many sort of counterexamples and just the inherent ambiguity of it. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Sure.
No, it does actually.
Yeah.
I would dumb it down to say that I was told this by somebody I really admire. He said that because God is outside of time, because God is infinity, he knows the beginning from the end. He knows the choices we'll make. We are given free will, but he still knows those choices. So there is predestination and free will can go hand in hand.
Yes, that's right. And so there is, so you may have heard like, Calvinism is on one end, right? And then Arminianism is on the other, where we have like total free will choice. There's actually a middle one, which isn't really talked about much. It's called Molinism, which kind of merges the two. It basically says like, yeah, look, we have free will, but like you said, God knows before he made the universe, he knew everything that would happen. And he knew our free will choice in that universe. It was still a free will choice we made, but God still knew it. And that's kind of this middle ground between the two. Now, an interesting question could still be, though, that let's say, Bob, God knew would not choose him in that free will choice in that universe, but God could have made a different universe then in which Bob did believe. And so that remains, it's a similar question as the predestination one now, which is why didn't God choose that person then? So even if you kind of back it up to pre-universe and say, well, it's a free will choice within that universe, God just knows it, you could still ask, well, why did God make that universe then? But I think what you said is basically yes. I think, yeah, we have a free will choice. God just knows it. And he knew it before we made it. He knew it before the universe began. So, yeah. But again, I'm not a pastor or theologian, so I don't want to call into question the truthfulness of the predestination Calvinist position, except to say I don't think there's a logical argument for it, but it still could be true. I mean, right? Just because something lacks a logical argument doesn't mean God, can do whatever he wants. Okay, so this one is the argument from reason. And this was presented by C.S. Lewis. And there's sort of two different forms of it. And I'll show us both because they sort of conclude a different thing. So I'll kind of divide this in half and give us both. So this is going to follow, again, very similarly from the idea of free will. And one thing to think about while we're doing this is kind of like I mentioned in the nature of forces, right? A force must act if the conditions are sufficient for it to do so. It cannot decide when to act. And this is like similar to a computer, right? Computers are programmed as to what they do. They cannot choose to do something else, right? And we were talking about free will and what's deterministic. Computers are deterministic. Whatever they are programmed to do, they will do. And even if they're programmed with a bug or an error, they will follow that and produce the error, right? And we perceive ourselves to not be like this, right? We believe that we have will, and we're not under strict programming. Even just for example, when computers generate random numbers, they're not really random, actually. It's just a complex mathematical equation that gives you numbers that look random. So even computers that do randomness is not really random. Even artificial intelligence is just following a very complex kind of series of instructions about how to interpret the world, okay? But it's still at its core deterministic, okay? So keep that in mind, because this is going to basically be what the crux of this thing is. Okay, so what C.S. Lewis said was, number one, no belief is rationally inferred two R's, okay, inferred if it can be fully explained in terms of non-rational causes. Okay, so what did he mean by this? Well, rational causes. Again, if you think of a computer, what amount of rational inference does a computer do? Nothing. Again, it's deterministic. What amount of deductive reasoning does a computer do? Nothing. It's not capable of these things. It does whatever it's programmed to do. Okay? So what C.S. Lewis said is, so no belief is rationally inferred if it can be fully explained in terms of non-rational causes. So if, like a computer, anything a computer can accomplish, can show, can demonstrate, can calculate is not a rational inference, okay? Because it's just a deterministic result, right? No math problem takes some deductive reasoning to figure out. It just takes a rule of math and you arrive at the answer the same way every time, right? So hopefully you're starting to see a little bit maybe of a distinction between like a deterministic process, and sort of ideas of reason, of this rational inference, okay? So then he said, if naturalism is true, so naturalism just being the idea that like, the physical natural world is all there is. If naturalism is true, then all beliefs can be explained in terms of non-rational causes. Can be explained in terms of non-rational causes. And again, why would this be? Well, kind of like I was saying about the chemicals and stuff, right? Doesn't have free will. If naturalism is true, the natural world is all there is, that everything just bows to the laws of physics, and that's all there is to it, then everything is deterministic. And there is no room or possibility for making these inferences, for making deductive reasoning, for coming to non-deterministic conclusions, because everything is just a math equation, right? So every single thing that that you believe to be true, everything that is true, everything that exists, can be fully explained by non-rational causes, by deterministic causes, because it all boils down to just a complex math equation. That's it. Okay. Number 3. Therefore, if naturalism is true, okay, then no belief is rationally inferred. Okay, so this basically just is just sort of a logical consequence of these two. So if naturalism is true, then all beliefs can be explained in terms of non-rational causes, and therefore no belief is then rationally inferred. So we come to no conclusions that a computer couldn't come to, or they couldn't be programmed to come to. Okay? There's no sort of like, yeah, this leap of reason, again, of deduction, right? 4. So we have good reason to accept naturalism. I'm gonna run out of room here. Naturalism, only if it can be rationally inferred. Only if it can be rational. If it can be rationally inferred from good evidence. Okay, so what C.S. Lewis is saying, right, is if someone presents to you some compelling evidence for anything, right, they expect you to be able to weigh the evidence and come to some rational conclusion. Okay, but this assumes that you are capable of making rational conclusions and that there are any rational conclusions that can be come to, right? Remember, if naturalism is true, there are no rational conclusions that can be come to, only deterministic conclusions. There's nothing a human can infer that a computer cannot. So you'd either have to program a computer to deterministically come to the conclusion that naturalism is true, or no human should accept it. And that's basically the conclusion here. Number 5, last bit. Therefore, there is not and cannot be a good reason to accept naturalism. A good reason to accept naturalism. So again, this is coming back to this idea, right, that I mentioned in the first class, that somehow belief in God is irrational, right? And what C.S. Lewis sort of identified in this argument is that if God does not exist, if naturalism is all there is no such thing as reason. The whole idea of reason, it doesn't even exist, right? Because everything then is just a math equation, a computer program. That's the entirety of reality. We're all just behaving deterministically. We cannot come to any rational conclusions, any inferences. There's no such thing as sort of deductive, reasoning. That's all an illusion. So if someone says, look, you shouldn't believe in God, and you should believe in naturalism, and here's my good reasons for it, why don't you make a rational, inference? They are undermining their own worldview by assuming we have the capability of doing that. And so that's what C.S. Lewis came to. The whole idea of reason, non-deterministic reason, only can be true if naturalism is false. Okay? Any questions about that? All pretty good. We're going to do a very similar thing again. So maybe, we can kind of learn by reinforcement here. So we're going to kind of look at the other sort of angle of it. Okay, hopefully I have enough room on the board here for this. The C.S. Lewis is a little verbose. Okay. Since everything in nature can be wholly explained in terms of non-rational causes, human reason, and here we even have a little handy definition which probably would have helped us earlier, but nevertheless, more precisely, the power of drawing conclusions based solely sorry, it's quite a long premise here, based solely on the rational cause of logical insight. I have to read this out again for myself even. Good grief. Rational cause of logical insight. Okay, since everything in nature can be wholly explained in terms of non-rational causes, human reason, bunch of brackets, must have a source outside of nature. Okay, whew, step back for a second here. Must have a source outside of nature. Okay, so first of all, C.S. Lewis gives us a definition to work with here, which is good. What is reason? The power of drawing conclusions based solely on the rational cause of logical insight. All right, so again, or we could say maybe drawing conclusions based on, incomplete information, right? You're filling in the gaps of incomplete information, coming to some sort of rational conclusion, okay? Which again, computers can't do. If computers lack information, the only thing they can do is come to a conclusion based on how the program tells them to come to a conclusion when they have limited information. Okay, so again, very deterministic. So he's saying, right, since everything in nature, I mean, this would be according to the, the naturalist thinks that everything in nature can be wholly explained in terms of non-rational causes, then human reason must have a source outside of nature. Otherwise, reason too would have its source in determinism, which sort of is a contradiction, because that's, again, disputing the very definition of it. And this is what he's going to say in the very next part here. If human reason came from non-reason, so again, or came from determinism, right? Non-reason, it would lose all rational credentials. All rational, or I'll put rationality because I'm running out of room and I don't need all these fancy words. Okay, so if human reason came from non-reason, it would lose all rationality. Okay, let's think about this for a minute. Let's take a bit of a segue here. There is a mathematician and apologist by the name of John Lennox. I think he's a professor of mathematics at Oxford at the moment, if I'm not mistaken. And one thing he says, he was talking with some of his, colleagues, and they'll say, well, they won't basically believe that there is such a thing as sort of this reason that surpasses rationality. And they'll say like, yeah, the brain is just a bunch of chemicals, okay? And that all that we, come to conclude is just based on these chemicals, okay? And so then John Lennox asked them, and you trust it? Why do you trust this brain that is telling you how to make rational conclusions based on a purely deterministic process? And by the way, you're trusting a brain, right, that you believe sort of came from non-reason. That's sort of what he's saying here, right? So if it was not deterministic, your brain came about from non-reason, and you're trusting it to trust it, right? Your brain is telling you, trust me, I know. Well, that's really a bit strange, because you're basically saying that like this random collection of chemicals came together, has somehow produced reason, and you should trust it. Well, yeah, right, yeah. Well, no one is reasonable if you believe the naturalist worldview. So yeah. Another example he gave was like, can you imagine? Okay, so we all have, our very fancy, phones, wonderful pieces of technology. Can you imagine if, one day we woke up and, we saw on the, internet, whatever, like, hey, we invented phones. You should go out and buy one, put all your banking information in it, trust it with all your secure data. And if someone said, oh, well, how'd you invent this thing? You're like, I don't know, we just found it in the lab one day. I don't know how it came about, but yeah, trust it with all your sensitive information. You would say no, right? But again, this is what they conceive the brain to be. How did the brain develop? I don't know. We should trust everything that tells us, right? This is really, really weird. And it's not reasonable, right? But again, this sort of worldview falls apart when they're saying like, my brain came about as a result of purely deterministic processes, and therefore I will trust everything it says according to my free will, right? That's really, really weird. And like C.S. Lewis said, that worldview loses all rationality. And again, sort of John Lennox gave us a couple examples of what that can mean. And I guess just while I'm on the subject too, there's a Christian philosopher who's still living. He's in the United States. His name is Alvin Plantinga. And one example he gives is like, the way the brain developed and evolution transpired, it was not done out of a pursuit of truth, right? It was done out of a pursuit of survival, right? So he gave an example. Imagine someone's life goal is to be eaten by a tiger, but they think that the tiger loves the chase. If I want to be eaten, I should run away if I see a tiger. Well, he will live to pass on his genes, but his beliefs are wrong. But evolutionarily, it doesn't matter, because evolutionary traits are selected for survival, not for truth. So again, we're apparently supposed to trust this brain that was developed by purely deterministic processes that had no reason to select true things, only things that would help us survive. Do you see? Again, there's no reason to believe the truth of what our brain tells us if we don't believe in this ability for reason to arise outside of nature. Okay? So let's sort of that segue aside, continue here. So again, sort of what C.S. Lewis was saying. So human reason cannot come from non-reason. Again, right? Where in the evolutionary chain would this have developed? Come from non. That's kind of ugly.
That works better, Ryan. Now I can see.
Yeah, sorry. See if I can reach. I guess I sort of can do that actually. Non-reason. Again, so human reason must come from a source. Okay, so human reason must come from a source outside of nature that is outside of nature that is itself rational. That is, self-rational. Okay, number 5. Let's see here. Let me this is a big one, C.S. Lewis. Come on, man. I don't know if I can fit it. Okay. Basically, he'll put, sort of, I'm going to just shorthand it like, Aquinas style chain of explaining reason. Okay. So the idea that like, hey, this, our rationality may be explained by some other thing outside nature that has reason, and that's explained by something else. Eventually, you're going to come to a first reason, right? Just so we learned the first mover, the first cause, a first reason, okay? And then finally, last thing here, therefore, there exists an eternal self-existent self-existent rational being that is the source, being that is the source of reason. Source of reason. Okay. Whew, that's a full board. All right. So this one over here is basically showing how the naturalist worldview leads to a contradiction. Okay, that you cannot have reason if you believe only in pure naturalism. And then on this side is sort of looking at it from the other angle, which is, okay, if we think that we do have reason and we can't explain it by nature, right? Just like I was saying, where in the evolutionary chain did reason come from? We can't explain it by nature. So it must be explained from something outside of nature. And okay, maybe that thing outside of nature got its reason from something else. But again, like we learned with the 5 ways of Aquinas, you can't go back forever. Eventually, you will find some being who is the source of reason, of the ability that we are able to, have these rational inferences, come to these, draw these conclusions of things, right? Because if that wasn't the case, then everything we think, again, is just deterministic. And there's no free will. There's no ability to come to any conclusions. And so again, right, you think of, again, I mentioned Sam Harris, who goes on these shows debating the merits of atheism, right? But again, if we look at sort of this through this lens of what C.S. Lewis shows here, the whole idea that he could, again, and he doesn't even believe in free will. So he doesn't believe in free will. And he's asking everyone to believe that there's no free will, and also believe that through this non-free will process, that we should be able to come to reasonably believe what he's saying. Right? So the whole thing from top to bottom is just a very contradictory worldview. Right? So the very idea of reason, of rationality, is not in contradiction with Christianity, as skeptics would have you believe, as I mentioned in the first class. Rather, the whole notion of reason points us to God, shows us that the only explanation for that reason is God. Okay, and this is C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. There's a lot of words on here, but is there any questions about how that works, either side of the board, and how naturalism is insufficient, how we need an explanation for our ability to reason? All good? Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you can watch. You like I said, I've watched my own videos many times, so you can watch the videos a couple times and send them to others. Or I mean, you can also just Google C.S. Lewis's argument from reason and read more. You're right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Send them to the class. Send them here. Yeah. Actually, I mentioned someone I knew that didn't believe in free will. The very first time around this class at the church, one of the attendees, she had a son who believed that he was an atheist, and so he came and he sat and he listened, and he didn't really agree with things I was saying, but he listened and he got to hear 5 classes of the arguments of the reasons of God. So yeah, if you know anyone who's interested, feel free to invite them, even if they don't believe. Okay, so that is C.S. Lewis's argument from reason. Now we're going to kind of continue this sort of idea again of rationality and reasons and this sort of determinism kind of thing. And so the next one we're going to look at, check what time it is here, 8:10. Okay. This is Leibniz's cosmological argument. Okay. So, who is Gottfried Leibniz? He was a mathematician and a Christian. And, you know, like a lot of these guys back in the day, like, you know, Pascal, I mentioned, Descartes. You know, I mentioned, I think it was last class, that a lot of people these days, again, to reference C.S. Lewis, C.S. Lewis said, you know, we like to think we're so enlightened and so smart. And people, you know, hundreds of years ago, yeah, they believed in God and they're just savage fools, right? And yet we look at people, these sort of like, you know, Renaissance thinkers and things, they were masters of everything on earth, right? So again, like Leibniz and Pascal, they would just wake up and be like, you know what, I feel like learning like geology today. And then they just write a paper and they'd be the world's expert in geology. Like they were literally masters of every field. And yet somehow we think because we have Wikipedia that we're smarter than all these, you know, amazing geniuses, right? So again, C.S. Lewis called this chronological snobbery, the idea that we are so enlightened, right? So Leibniz, yeah, very, very brilliant guy. He sort of co-created the mathematical field of calculus, Christian, you know, theologian, all kinds of good stuff. And so, you know, we've been looking at the ways of Aquinas, which was really concerned with sort of this like chain of causality, chain of motion, chain of energy. What Leibniz was interested in was not sort of chains of causality and existence. He was interested in the reason for things. Like, what is the reason for something? Okay, so, you know, for example, I'm standing up here tonight. What is the reason I am here? Well, I mean, my legs propelled me here, okay? My vehicle was able to, you know, drive. That's a reason. I wanted to be here. That's a reason. The food I ate gave me the energy to come here. That's a reason. Like, you start to see there's a lot of reasons for why I'm here, but you can start to maybe kind of form a bit of a bubble of like, okay, all of these things added together is the reason why I'm here, right? But another reason I'm here is that like my mom gave birth to me, right? That's one of the reasons why I'm here, because I wouldn't be here if that wasn't the case. And so again, there's kind of a lot of reasons of why I'm here, but you can kind of imagine that you could maybe, through an exhaustive kind of effort, come together of all the things that explain why I'm here. The fact that I'm here, what is the, you know, kind of reason that you kind of grow this bubble? And what he said was, okay, all contingent, there's that word again, right? Contingent facts have an explanation. Okay, so what is the reason that the contingent things exist instead of not existing, right? That's what contingent means, right? Something exists or something is true, but it needn't have been so. So I'm here tonight. I didn't have to be here. So that the reason I'm here and not somewhere else demands an explanation. There is an explanation for that thing. Okay. But then he said, well, look, okay. The reason I give for me being here, well, that demands an explanation. My mom gave birth to me. What is the reason for that? Right? Well, part of the reason is her mother gave birth to her. Again, we're kind of get this Aquinas kind of causality going, right? It's a chain. And so we start to actually, when we think of the reason I'm here, it actually involves a lot of other reasons and the explanation of those reasons and the explanation of those, and it kind of starts making this bigger and bigger kind of bubble. And he said, you know, all contingent explanations have explanations. Have explanations. Okay. Yes. Yeah.
When did he live?
You know, you asked me last time about Aquinas, and I looked it up. I said like 1200 plus. It was like almost exactly 1200. I nailed that one. So let's see, live. Yeah. Yeah. Later, I think. You know, 1500s is what I'm gonna guess. I'll look that up. 1500. I blame my history teacher. He always told me dates don't matter. It's just like the order of things that matter, roughly. You know. So, yeah. 1640. Well, plus or minus 100 years, you know. Plus or minus a century. What's a century, give or take, right? All contingent explanations have explanations. There is a contingent explanation. Oh, back down a bit. Explanation that explains all other contingent facts and explanations. Okay, so what do you mean by that? Well, if we think of my growing bubble of all the reasons I'm here, right? So again, I'm here because again, food and car and okay, my mom and her mom and her mom and the circumstances of that, her life and on and on. Well, eventually, the beginning of the universe explains all these things. That sort of contains within itself all the answers, right? Because all the events that followed from the beginning of the universe explain this all. So the fact that the universe began is sort of a contingent explanation of all these other things that came out of it. Okay, so again, kind of the idea of growing this sort of bubble of explanation of reason. But if you think of it though, now there's no more room to grow the bubble. So the explanation of that, like a arrow, that thing there, okay, is necessary. Right. So if you've grown your bubble to like encompass all other explanations, well, that thing is still contingent. It still needs an explanation. Well, again, kind of like with Aquinas, we're out of room. Now we need something that is not contingent, but necessary. So the reason why the universe exists to begin with is a necessary reason. I mean, necessary means like it couldn't have been false. It is true, right? And kind of like Aquinas was fond of saying, this thing we call God, right? And Leibniz, what he called this was the principle of sufficient reason. It is the reason that explains all other reasons. And we see that it must be necessary. So this reason, this necessary reason that explains all other reasons, right, itself has no reason for its existence. The only sort of reason of its existence is by nature of its own being. It exists because it exists, right? Kind of what God said, right? I am who I am, right? That's it. Right? You can't go back any further in terms of explanatory information. So this is sort of showing that we need some necessary, meaning self-existent, pre-existent reason that explains all things. But you notice though, it's not just that the reason is necessary. Well, this must be a very powerful reason, right? Because this reason gave rise to the creation of the universe. That's a pretty powerful reason. But it's not only that it's powerful. If the universe is contingent, again, that means, right, that it could have existed or not. And so that must mean this reason, again, like I mentioned last week, chose to make the universe. Right? So this necessary reason is self-existent, powerful enough to make the universe, has the will to contingently bring it about. But I'll think about this too. When we think of the universe, okay, Mars exists as a planet. Did it have to exist? Or could there have been a universe without Mars? Well, probably it didn't have to exist. We can all imagine Mars could have not existed. We can imagine a different configuration of the universe. But that must mean then, so then we ask ourselves, why does Mars exist? What is the reason Mars exists? Well, if you trace this back, the reason is because God made it that way. So that means that God chose this universe to have Mars. There can be no other reason. Because again, you would just have this problem of kind of growing the bubble and going back and asking, what's the reason for that? What's the reason for that? And coming again to the necessary reason, the only kind of remaining thing. So the reason that Mars is there is fundamentally God chose for it to be meaningfully, willfully chose for Mars to exist, right? And not just Mars, of course, every feature of the universe, God chose to specifically be like that. Because again, otherwise, what's the reason? Because again, we can't remember, like kind of say with the computer, you can't say, well, it was just random. Well, no, because what is the reason that randomness can happen? Or like a computer, it just has an equation. So you can't just be, it was random. What is the reason? And again, you're going to have to keep tracing this trail back until you find the necessary like nucleus of all these reasons, which is God. So again, this sufficient reason is necessary, meaning self-existent, all powerful because it brought about the universe out of nothing. It was the sole reason for everything to exist. It had a will because it contingently made the universe at a moment in time, that we learned last week too. And it must be actually maximally intelligent because it chose exactly the universe to make, right? It chose Mars to exist instead of not exist. It chose a universe that is intelligible. We can understand it. And in fact, we have intelligence. So what is the reason our universe is intelligible? What is the reason we have intelligence? Well, the reason for all those things is God, right? So it only makes sense that God is maximally intelligent because he gave rise to the intelligibility of all things, right? The intelligence of all of us. So again, with this one kind of argument, we see that actually we've demonstrated pretty much almost every fundamental property of God, that he's necessarily existent, all-powerful, has a will, so he's like a person, right? And omniscient. He knows all things, maximally intelligent. He knew to create this universe and not a different universe. Because again, you ask, what is the reason God chose this one instead of that one? Well, the reason is God. That's what it comes down to every time. That is the reason, God. Right? And sort of, I mean, that's the only thing left in our bubble of reason. So with this one proof, we basically, as I said, showed pretty much every fundamental property we need for a creator being. Any questions about this one?
Well, you just helped me understand why those super smart grade 2 kids say to me, Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Now can say them your
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah.
Aha, yes. Yeah, that's right. So, when armed with this, we can probably get rid of the last like 8 proofs because this sort of encompasses the whole thing. That's kind of why I like putting it at the end. It just sort of summarizes all these things in one. Is that hand? Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 I'm not sure I totally understand.
I know, I'm not sure if I'm asking the right question.
Mhm.
I'm trying to figure out. I mean, works somehow in a linear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you move forward once you understand source?
Mm-hmm.
Where do you fit with this chemicals do
Mm-hmm.
going forward? I'm wrestling with it.
Mm-hmm.
Ancient explanations have explanations.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that propel you?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm so okay. So I'm not sure if I'm exactly understanding, but like, once the universe has begun, I mean, it sort of has the power to bring about more contingent things, right? So you that's why you only need one necessary thing to kind of start the whole chain, right? This is kind of Aquinas's thing too about, you need the first mover, right? The unmoved mover, the uncaused cause. Once the chain is off and running, I mean, then it doesn't even really matter anymore, right? And this is sort of why, some skeptics kind of, well, at least historically, liked the idea of that the universe was just infinite. Because if they remove the idea of that starting state, well, then no problem, because we have the fire's burning. We don't need to ask what started the fire. It's just burning now, right? It just sort of feeds on itself in that sense. Does that help at all? Okay. Okay. Yes.
Like on that, I heard something else along the lines of like why we keep going forward. And I don't know the details of it, but it's about like we're wired to get to the top of the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes us go forward.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way God has wired us to be the best. And when we have human things that try to take that away from us, it's going against the way we're wired.
Mm-hmm.
And he's outside of time. So here and here are two places that God knows that we don't.
Mm-hmm.
But our time here is trying to be better all the time, to strive to be the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, and again, the interesting thing is I think we have, again, a naturalist explanation for why that's true because, well, again, evolutionarily speaking, you're going to want to attempt the best you can in order to survive and pass on your genes. But of course, we have sort of the metaphysical explanation too, which is, actually, this is going to come up in the very next one, actually. That's kind of an interesting segue, right? We understand God to be emblematic of the best. And so if God made us in his image, then we should have naturally strive for the best, right? And so that's a really interesting point, and it's going to actually tie perfectly into the next one. So that was a very good question. Mm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is the ontological argument. Now,
These, just so you know, these words are not in my everyday world.
yes. So, yeah. So okay. So ontology is sort of the idea, the study of being, of beingness. So the ontological argument is a study of like what it means to be. Okay.
So this is ontological argument number 2.
Yeah.
We had one.
Did I do this one already? What did I do before?
Well, if you want to do it again,
Oh.
because we probably need it.
Okay.
Number 2.
Number 2.
What?
Proofs of Aquinas,
Yeah.
ontological.
No, that was the Kalam Cosmological.
That's next. That's number 3.
What was that? Let me see. Let's see your notes here.
I made the notes.
I made the notes.
But, you probably could do the whole thing, and we'd just agree with you, and we wouldn't have remembered.
Maybe, yeah. Hold on. Let me think here.
You didn't write it down.
Who printed this up?
I did not do that.
Let's go back.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me check my notes from last week here. Let me check my notes. Okay, so I had my written down last week. I had the Ways of Aquinas, the Kalam Cosmological, the fine tuning. Oh, you have it on the board?
No, this is a picture I took of your session last week.
Oh yeah, because that's the Kalam Cosmological. Yeah, and fine tuning, morality, and the forces. So I think maybe that's just yeah, that might be an incorrect. Yeah, fine tuning I did last week. I think once I start it, you're going to see that it's. Well, I don't think we did it. Because this one is going to melt everyone's brain, So if you thought everything up to this point was confusing, yeah, buckle up. This one is ludicrous. Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So this one is crazy. Okay. So, so if you thought the other ones were nuts, this one, strap in. Okay. So first of all, this argument has been like refined over centuries by, again, we're going to see a lot of names, like the who's who of like Christian thinkers, okay? So first of all, it was first developed by St. Thomas Anselm, who was the Bishop of Canterbury. And what he was pondering was, he was sort of praying and meditating, and he thought, oh, God, you're the greatest. Like, how could there be anything greater than you, God? And then he started to wonder, like, yeah, what would it mean to be greater than God? And if something was greater than God, wouldn't that be God? And he started to kind of follow this chain of what would that mean? And so when he developed it, he sort of had kind of 8 little arguments for it, 8 premises. And about 5 of the 8 were pretty well accepted and understood. Yeah, that makes sense, okay? But 3 people didn't buy it, they rejected it. Since then, 2 more have basically been like proven in logic. Okay, so this, again, we're gonna have a big preamble here because it's gonna sort of undercut the fact that this is not gonna make any sense to anybody in a second. But it has like a very rigorous argumentation in something I'll write over here called modal logic, which is a branch of mathematics. You know, when I'm doing sort of my little symbolic notation up here, we're using propositional logic, which is a branch of mathematics. This is another one, modal logic. And modal logic is all about these ideas again of like being. What does it mean to be, to exist, okay? So St. Thomas Anselm developed it. This was refined by René Descartes, who again, you'll remember, was, you know, a mathematician, philosopher, Christian. Then this was further refined by the guy we just talked about, Gottfried Leibniz. Okay. It was then further refined by Kurt Gödel, who you may remember from the first class of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. Give that guy the old umlaut. It was further refined by the philosopher I just mentioned, Alvin Plantinga. And then, interestingly, possibly the most modern version, this is not a name you're going to recognize. There's actually a professor at my old university, I went to the University of Waterloo in Ontario, who's done, again, probably the most up-to-date proof of this in modal logic. I can send it out. It would take me a full day to understand how this proof works. So, you know, if you're like a kind of Goodwill Hunting genius, maybe you'll get it right away. But at the very least, you might just be interested to know that it exists. So I can send it out, yeah, proof in modal logic, modern. Proof in modal logic. I won't put his name because, again, he's not a famous person. But anyway, proof it does exist. And so, again, what's shocking, in a sense, is that this argument has fascinated philosophers and mathematicians and logicians over centuries. And they've all sort of sought to refine it, to get it really, really amazing. And what's interesting is that there's no counter argument to it. And that's, again, what has really fascinated philosophers, because a lot of these other ones, people will present some kind of counter argument. This one, no one has presented a credible counter argument. So for centuries, these sort of Christian thinkers have been refining it, and no one has mounted any credible defense, which is really interesting. And then finally, I'll mention C.S. Lewis says this is what converted him. Okay, so this is a powerful one. Okay, that preamble aside, let's go into what it actually is. Yeah, modal logic, yeah. It's sort of about like the idea of existence, of necessary existence, contingent existence, and these kind of ideas. Yeah. And so I'm not going to do the whole proof in modal logic because, again, it's pages and pages, and it would take me, I said, a day to understand it, let alone write it on the board. But I will just give you kind of the rough kind of highlight of it. Here's how it goes. If you can imagine A and B such that B is greater than A, then A is not God. Okay. Because we're basically defining God to be sort of the greatest conceivable being. This is what sort of Anselm was praying, right? God, what could be greater than you? What could be greater? And he concluded, there's nothing greater than God. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, what that means, right, if you can picture two things and one of them is greater, well, then certainly the first one is not God. You at least know that much, okay? So again, it's not saying, right, it's not saying B is God, right? Only that if B is greater than A, then A is not God, okay? And he also said it is greater to exist than not exist. Exist than not exist. And 3, it is greater to necessarily exist than possibly exist. Okay, now, a couple sort of bookkeeping things before we dive into it. Possibly exist. First of all, the idea of greater means that we must have some rule by which we can evaluate whether something is greater or lesser, right? So we are going to, when we're doing sort of this thought experiment here, we're going to choose the attribute of God, knowledge, okay? Why? Well, because it has a very clear ordering mechanism. If you know more facts, then you're greater than someone who knows fewer facts, right? So we can have a very clear understanding of how that would be ordered. So the greatest being is the one that knows all facts, right? And you can order it down the line. Versus if we said, well, let's look at God's goodness. How could you order goodness? That one's hard, right? There's not really an objective measure. We can say, well, he's maximally good, whatever that means. I don't really know what that means. Really, it's kind of circular because to be good is just kind of to be like emblematic of the qualities of God. So you see, we have a really fuzzy definition. But knowledge, we all know what that means. You know this number of facts. So we're going to look at that one just in that way. And so you also have to ask someone, is it possible? You don't believe in God. That's fine. Is it possible, not even in this universe, is it possible, as I mentioned, some of these skeptics, they believe in, right, multidimensional metaphysical quantum space, right? So is it possible in one of those multidimensional quantum spaces, is it possible, even if it's not true, but is it possible that God could have existed in one of those multidimensional spaces? And if they say no, it is not possible in any dimension, in any reality, in any universe for God to have ever existed, you might not really be talking with an intellectually honest person, right? Because if they're not even willing to admit the possibility, not even that God, right? I'm not saying God exists in this universe, just the possibility that there could have been some version, some dimension of reality that he could have existed, right? Presumably someone will hopefully say, yeah, it's possible, okay? But now what we're going to find, and this is going to be the mind-melting leap of insanity here, the fact that they said it's possible in some dimension that God exists, we're going to conclude that God exists. And this is how it goes. So it's possible for the greatest being to exist in some reality. It's possible. But wait a minute. That's not the greatest being then, is it? Right? Because it's greater to definitely exist than not exist. So it couldn't be the fact that the greatest possible being could exist in that dimension. That's not the greatest then. He must exist, right? We think of, like, for example, regardless of how many facts we know, we all know more than, pick any literary figure like Sherlock Holmes, Gandalf the Wizard, right? They're smart people, but they actually know 0 facts, right? They don't exist. So it doesn't matter how many facts we know. As long as we know more than 1 fact, we know more. We're greater than these imaginary characters, or these fictional characters. So if we're saying it's possible for God to exist in some dimension, well, then that's not God then, right? Because the greatest possible being, he definitely exists, right? He does exist in that dimension. So if someone is saying it's possible for the greatest possible being to exist in that dimension, we say, well, that's not the greatest possible. The greatest possible being must exist in that dimension. But wait a minute, that's still not the greatest, right? Because he doesn't just possibly exist in that dimension, right? He would have to possibly exist in our dimension, right? So, okay, so this, the greatest possible being does exist in that dimension and possibly exists in this dimension. But wait, that's still not the greatest, right? Because the greatest possible being would have to exist in this dimension and that one and all of them, and not contingently necessarily exist, right? Is greater to necessarily exist than possibly exist. So if that's the greatest possible being, well, then God must exist in all dimensions. The end. And that's the end of the proof. Yeah, And you might be thinking like, wait a minute, you didn't say anything yet. Where did the proof go, right? But it's this really, really weird thing where if the greatest, if really greatest, if that's what we're saying, greatest, well, we know some things about what it means to be great, right? We know that if we can imagine two things, then the lesser one is not the greatest. We know that the greatest thing will exist, not exist, and the greatest thing necessarily exists. So if it's possible for the greatest possible being to exist, well, that's not the greatest. The greatest one would necessarily exist. And right? And so, and not just in one dimension, right? But in all of them. And so, like I said, the very fact that someone will admit the possibility of the greatest conceivable being existing, by this proof, you conclude the greatest possible being necessarily exists in all dimensions.
I don't get that. Like if someone says possibly, then they kind of don't really believe that. They're just saying that. And so why does it make it then true that God exists in a different way?
So let me show you by the only form of counterexample that's ever been proposed, and maybe I'll explain why it doesn't work for anything. This only works for God, actually, and I'll show you why. So counterexample goes like this. Well, it's possible that the greatest unicorn exists, right? It's possible the greatest unicorn exists, and therefore, it's necessary the greatest unicorn exists in all dimensions. That's kind of what you're saying, right? But wait a minute. What does it mean to be the greatest possible unicorn? What is the ordering of unicorns? There's no ordering of unicorns, right? Or someone will say, it's possible the greatest pizza exists, and therefore it's necessarily the fact the greatest pizza exists. And you say, wait a minute, how do you order pizzas? Because obviously pineapple must be at the top. And other people say, no, it's not. So yeah, right? So there is no order. And this is why we chose knowledge, because we are able to order it. So this only works, this proof, it is the narrowest scope possible. This proof only works for qualities that have a strict ordering for which it's possible that the maximal degree of that ordering can exist. So that's why we chose knowledge, because knowledge, we have an ordering and we can imagine what a maximal thing is. Literally knows all facts, right? So we have not only the order, we have what the definition of the maximum, which doesn't exist for anything else other than God, and only for certain qualities of God, like knowledge. Like I said, goodness, this doesn't even work for, right? So it only works for, again, if you have an ordering and a strict definition of the maximal thing and the understanding that that thing could exist. So we can imagine it is possible that some being could know all the facts, right? This is possible. We have a rigorous, all well understood definition of what that would mean and an ordering of how we would all stack up, which isn't true of unicorns or pizzas or humans or almost anything else you can imagine. And so once you understand these couple things, right? You need an ordering, you need a definition of what the greatest being is. Then once you have that, the rest of it literally just falls out of these premises. Because as you're picturing, okay, so you're picturing A and B. So, okay, right, you ask someone, is it possible the greatest possible knowledge being exists? And if they say yes, you say, okay, well, let's look around us. What can we imagine? I can imagine a being that possibly exists in some dimension and a being that necessarily exists in that dimension. Well, which one then is greater? Well, the necessary one, right? I can imagine a being that necessarily exists in that dimension or necessarily exists in all dimensions. But again, we have this ordering. We have this comparison scheme. Well, then the one that exists in all dimensions is greater. So if it's possible for this is the other person agreeing to you. Yes, it is possible. They said it. It's possible the greatest possible being exists. Then you just, I mean, again, this is why I said it's going to melt your brain, because it almost doesn't make sense. Right? How could, like I said, how can it be true? Mm-hmm.
Say that, if they don't really believe it, but they'll just say that, oh yeah, it's possible. So then, but if you say, well, then do you think that it could be in our dimension? They'll say no, because that dimension they kind of don't believe in anyway. So they're saying, oh, it's possible because I'm just humoring you because I know you don't believe
Uh-huh.
That's where I'm going.
But this is the interesting thing, right? So if they say, you ready? Watch this. If they say it is possible the greatest conceivable being exists, then what they just said to you is a contradiction. Oh, but not in this dimension. Well, that's not the greatest then. So which is it? Does the greatest possible being exist? Or does the greatest possible being only exist in another dimension? Because those both can't be true, right? Well, okay, so no, well, I mean, I was trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's collapse it all down then. So they only believe in one dimension. So you say, is it possible? So you don't believe God exists. Fine, God doesn't exist. Is it possible somehow he could have existed? Right? So just one dimension. And if they say no, I mean, like, I just don't, this person is just not honest, right? Like, how can you have a conversation where they say, not only do I not believe God exists, it is impossible for that he ever could have existed. How can they make that claim? Were they at the Big Bang? This is like the book of Job, right? You know, were you there when I laid the foundations of the world? Were you there when the Big Bang happened? How do you know it's impossible that God could never have existed? How can someone claim that?
Basically, they're declaring themselves to be all knowledgeable if they say no.
That's kind of, yeah. Yeah, kind of, yeah. Right? But like you think of it, there is no way they could make that claim, not with any degree of intellectual honesty. How can they say, no, it is impossible. God never, ever could have existed. Right? That would imply they understand what happened before the universe was made. But they don't. They don't know that. How could they know that?
But they'll say the same thing, like, you don't know that.
Well, but again, like, right, that's true. But then you'll say, well, I have a proof in modal logic. What do you have? Well, I mean, right? Like, I mean, at a certain point, right? Like, you know, like, that's the thing, right? Is that, you know, some people will say, like, well, what's the difference between you and me? You know, you say there's a God, I say there's not a God. Who's to say which of us is right? Well, then you'll say, like, well, I have, you know, 10 arguments for the existence of God in modal logic, propositional logic, you know, the fine tuning of, you know, this and that. Like, the skeptic has nothing. And again, if you encounter anything, I would love to know it, because I have not found anything other than, well, I believe in evolution, which again, as we've showed, is nothing. That's not anything, right?
They know the amount of hairs on each person's head.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, I mean, the idea of this whole multiple dimension thing was to give the benefit to the skeptic, to say, like, to even let them say it is impossible for God to ever have existed in this dimension. Again, how they would ever conclude that, they can't. But again, give them the benefit of the doubt, but give them that, like, little bit of wiggle room for them to say, yeah, in some other dimension that's not ours, fine, right? Again, this is sort of to kind of like with Pascal's wager. You're stacking the deck in their favor so that you can show it doesn't matter. You give them all the odds you want. They still inexorably comes to the conclusion that God exists. So again, like I said, it's really, really weird. It only works for very specific qualities of God and literally nothing else, because nothing else is like this in terms of having an ordering and having a well-understood idea of a perfect thing that any intellectually honest person would have to say it's possible that it exists. And like I said, it's you know, there's an argument in modal logic. It's been refined over centuries by philosophers and mathematicians and logicians. And again, the best counterexample is, then there must be it's necessary that the greatest unicorn exists. Like, that literally is the best argument for this. And like I've said, that doesn't stand up, because you can't order the best unicorn. There's no definition of the best unicorn. So again, over centuries now, centuries and centuries, this argument has been strengthened and strengthened and strengthened, and no one has come up with an argument against it. So which is, again, you'd think if it was really that bizarre, it would just be refuted and laughed at. But no one can do it, right? No, like, serious philosopher or mathematician can refute this. And again, it was enough that C.S. Lewis was like, yep, that got me. All right, so, you know, for the average person, is this going to really convince them? You know, maybe not, right? But for some people it did. It does for C.S. Lewis. And again, at the very least, it's just another arrow in our quiver, right? To say again, like, please present all the arguments you have for God not existing, and I will present you all of this 9, 10, whatever, again, including ones with very rigorous formulations in mathematics. And someone can choose not to believe it if they want, but like at a certain point, they're really believing against the evidence, right? Which, I mean, you may not convince them, but at the very least, hopefully they may see like that their position is becoming very tenuous if they have to say, well, fine, I don't believe in mathematics anymore. I don't believe in modal logic. I don't believe that I have reason. I don't believe that I have free will. I don't believe in morality. I don't believe in the fine tuning of the universe, like on and on and on. They're just going to have to say, to admit that their position just doesn't make any sense. So yeah, ontological argument. Like I said, pretty bizarre, but fascinating. Just the historical, kind of context of how it was developed. Fascinating. There's no counter arguments to it. Fascinating that it exists like in modal logic. It's really, really amazing. Any questions about that one? Yeah. Yes, the whole proof in modal logic. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, didn't the whole sort of evolution discussion started with the question, what if there isn't a God?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that the core of that? Like around the 1400s, Richelieu or whatever his name was,
Mm-hmm.
he philosophically posed that question, and that really is what started. There was never really any consideration about evolution until that question started to get discussed philosophically, right? What if there isn't a God? And everything with evolution kind of came from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and like, again, this is why say it's nothing. Like, there's no cosmological implications to the analysis of evolution, right? Because again, as we've shown, look at Leibniz's cosmological argument. What is the reason that evolution was able to proceed in that way, right? What is the reason the universe existed? Again, look at, the motion, the energy. What gave it the energy? What gave it the motion? What allowed it to develop morality and will out of this naturalist process? Like, these are really interesting questions that have, as we sort of saw C.S. Lewis's conclusion, have answers only outside of nature. So, the idea of evolution or this and that, it just has no bearing on the idea of, again, cosmology, of the source of reason, of morality, of free will. It literally is just, and it has no more connotations to the existence of God or not than, how the heart works, right? Which is a fascinating thing. But we don't say like, well, because my heart beats, there's no God, right? But yeah, right. It's just, yeah. I mean, it's just biology. Like, well, what do you mean? Actually, I'll tell you one other thing too. I mean, again, I don't like harping on evolution, other than to just say like it doesn't have nothing to say about God, about the existence of God or not. And so actually, this kind of ties into the next one here. The very last one we're going to look at is the idea that the universe we're living in is a simulation. Yeah. And the thing is, right, so I just saw this today. Some scientists think about this. Are we living in a simulation? And one thing, I can't remember the name of the scientist. I just read it like during dinner before I came here tonight. He said, well, you know what, like, whether it was simulation or not, we can't prove it one way or the other. It's not what they call falsifiable. And so it's not science. And that's true. That's how science works, right? Science has a hypothesis, you test it, it's falsifiable, right? Again, as I mentioned, evolution is not falsifiable. You cannot prove it one way or the other. So again, it could be true, it could be wrong, but it's not science. And that's the thing I've never understood about people's, like, they're like, well, I believe in science because I believe in evolution. Evolution is not science, right? It doesn't follow the scientific method. It's not testable, it's not observable, it's not repeatable, it's not predictable, it's not falsifiable, right? What was that? Yeah, and it's like, it's historical, maybe, right? Like, it could be a historical thing, but like, again, we don't consider history to be science either, right? It's an analysis of sort of historical events. which again is really not trying to badmouth it in any way other than to say like, to combat scientism, right? The idea that somehow our scientific understanding prevents the need for God or explains away the existence of God, right? Which, as we've seen, this will be the 10th time now, is just, utter folly. Okay, so this idea, the universe is a simulation, this has been gaining some traction these days. Like Elon Musk believes this very strongly, right? That we live in a simulation. Of course, the movie The Matrix I mentioned last week, and thinking about Descartes and what can we know, was all premised on this idea that it's a simulation. All the people are just in pods, and their brains are just running around these lives in a simulation. I mentioned previously in this class the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? Who also thinks we might be living in a simulation. He's an astrophysicist, So I mean, there are real people that actually believe this. Okay. Now, why might they think this? Well, there are a lot of things about our universe that don't make much sense. So, for example, I mentioned, why can we even understand it? Right? Albert Einstein, Descartes felt this was very weird, that we can even understand our reality. And one other interesting thing, again, thinking about these ideas of like free will and our experience of things, okay? Again, think about chemicals. Now, do chemicals ponder their existence and what they should do and how they should react? No, they just do, right? Deterministically, they just do. What about a bacteria, a virus? Do you contemplate how they live out their bacterial lives? No, they just exist. They just, plants, right? Plants are living, but they just exist. And yet we have this weird thing where we are conscious, right? We understand our experience, right? We're not just somehow mindlessly going about our business like spiders and plants and single-celled organisms, right? There's something different about us. We have, again, this consciousness. We have this experience that we're able to interpret. But this is really strange, because why would we develop this? This is a lot of energy and processing power in our brain that has no evolutionary advantage. It doesn't help us. It doesn't help us survive. It doesn't help us do anything. And yet we have somehow, why did our brains develop this really complex feature that we have consciousness? And I watched a recent discussion again between, I think I mentioned Sean McDowell, who's the son of Christian author Josh McDowell, who wrote tons and tons of books. So his son is a speaker and apologist. He was interviewing an atheist philosopher, and he asked this atheist fellow, he said, is there anything that gives you pause and makes you think maybe atheism is not true? And he said there are two things. Number one, that religious belief seems to produce in people the right kind of behaviors that we value as a society. And atheism can't explain that. Okay? So belief in God seems to produce behaviors that keep society together. Number one. Number two, he said, consciousness. There's no naturalist explanation for consciousness, right? And this idea has, again, kind of baffled philosophers for a long time. Is why do we have this sense of being able to perceive things and understand it? Because we don't have to, right? Like plants, they don't have this, but they still live and grow, and even the Venus flytrap eats flies. Okay, like, right? It still does things, right? Some bizarre behaviors of plants, but they do things. They survive. They thrive, right? They multiply, whatever, right? So evolutionarily, we didn't need this, and it uses up a lot of like energy, right? So again, you think of sort of how evolution works, right? If there was a way for a species to evolve that required less energy for its upkeep, that's how it would evolve. Because it needs to find less food, puts itself less at risk, et cetera, right? Helps its survival. So it doesn't make evolutionary sense that we would have this feature. And so again, right, I mentioned I'm a game developer, okay? So think of a video game. If you can think of a video game, what is the purpose of the world, of the graphics? Well, it's not for the characters in the game, right? It's for the player. The characters in the game don't understand the graphics that are shown on screen. They don't understand the nature of the world as some sort of whole that can be explored, right? That's for the player. It's not for the person in the game. So is it possible that the reason we have consciousness is not because of any evolutionary advantage, but because this is for the benefit of the player, the designer, for God, right? That our experiences in this world, in this reality, is somehow, I mean, not a game in the same sense, but somehow some kind of interactive experience that God is watching, evaluating, interacting with. And our conscious understanding of the reality of God, of our relationship to God, of our free will choices, is somehow meaningful to God. And I think this basically actually comports with our understanding of God, right? That God made us to love us, to be in relationship with us, and that free will decision, that relationship, was meaningful and important, right? And so if we didn't have consciousness, we couldn't have that, right? So that is actually an explanation of how we could have consciousness that, again, evolution and naturalism doesn't begin to explain, okay? Take a drink here. And again, some people will argue again. And so I'm not, like, when I first heard this, I was like, these people are like daft. Like, who would believe this, right? That we actually all are in like the matrix, they're in pods, right? But if you just kind of consider that, maybe don't think of it, universe is a simulation, but like universe is a designed reality. Well, that is exactly what we believe, right? This reality is intentionally designed. And that's kind of what the simulation means. Right? So again, this is sort of, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Elon Musk and other philosophers and scientists, again, they're doing our work for us because they're out there trying to show that our reality was intentionally designed, which is exactly what we want to show anyway, right? Which is perfect for us. Right? And so, this idea that our reality has these features that don't make sense. Why can we understand it? Why do we have consciousness? Right? These don't make sense in a naturalist understanding of the world. And a couple other really interesting ideas from physics, right? Why can nothing travel faster than the speed of light? Right? Again, if you think of the universe, again, I'm a video game developer, right? So when we make games, if the players kind of gets to the edge of the world, so we you don't like show the whole world on the screen, you just show what the player can see. If the player gets to the edge of the world, you start showing that part now because they're there, right? Then you stop showing the other part, okay? And so if if God is running a simulation of the universe, this makes a lot of sense then. So he's basically capped our ability to see certain distances, but sort of by the speed of light. So when we look over there, fill in the details, right? The universe is expanding. As we keep looking further, God's like, all right, I'll add some more details over there, right? Which again is a really weird way to think of it. But again, these kind of features mimic exactly what people like myself, designers, do when we make worlds. It's exactly the same. So again, to a video game developer, the idea that this universe is designed shares like all the same hallmarks of it, right? And again, I mean, not to maybe toot my own horn here, but in this world, who do you think knows more about simulated realities than video game designers, right? They're the masters of it. That's their whole job, right? And so we look at it in that perspective, it shares a lot in common with the closest thing we understand to a simulated reality. Just one last example. What time is it here? Oh, it's already past 9. Okay, final example. I don't know if have heard much about like quantum mechanics, but one very weird thing about quantum mechanics is that subatomic particles don't seem to have any determined value properties until they're observed. Until they're observed, they seem to behave indeterminately. It's really, really bizarre. But again, the question would be, if I were God or some programmer making reality, why would you waste processing power on things no one's looking at? So when someone looks at that electron, be like, all right, let's figure out what that is, and that's fine. And otherwise, who cares? Don't waste processing power on it. So again, our universe really, really looks like someone who built it in the way that game designers build realities. So again, this is kind of just more like a fun example, kind of rest our brains maybe after the ontological argument. But I think it's really interesting, right? That again, according to this atheist philosopher, he couldn't explain consciousness. Why do we have this? Again, like free will and morality. Why do we have consciousness? And why is our universe comprehensible? Why is it intelligible? Why does it look like how game designers make video games? I don't know, but it's really interesting to think about. Okay, it's already past 9 o'clock. Any just kind of final questions about this one or any other ones we went over? Universe as a simulation. Again, I mean, it's sort of just a fun thing to think about. All good. Okay, so of course, I'll be sending out the video again. If you do have any questions, please feel free to email me anytime. Let me know. And yeah, obviously, always happy to kind of try to explain more where possible, especially for some of the weird ones. But anyway, why don't we pray and finish up here for tonight? Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much, God, that we had so much to talk about regarding the arguments for your existence. Again, it's just so amazing that no matter how we look at reality, again, from modal logic or through ideas of free will, consciousness, morality, we look at the quantum nature of our reality, the fine-tuning, everything we look at always points to you. And I just thank you, God, that you've given us so many reasons, and in fact have given us reason that we can understand this, that we can come to know you, can come to appreciate just the power and awesomeness of you, of this universe, and the privilege of knowing you. So I just thank you, God. I just really pray for your truth to really inspire all the hearts of people who are here, especially even for the tricky bits, Lord, that they'd really ruminate in their hearts and they'd come to have great insight and be able to share and positively affect others around them as well, God, and really again share this message that faith in you is not contrary to reason. It really is inexorably reason itself, God. So we thank you again for all this, and of course, ultimately, not just that you made the universe, but again, we thank you that you sent your son Jesus to die for us, God, that we can have forgiveness of sins, a relationship with you that makes all this worthwhile. So thank you, Lord. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, thanks for hanging in there. Yeah, you're very welcome. And yeah, feel free to ask me any questions. And otherwise, I'll see you next week where we look at, now we're going to start talking about the Bible and the necessity of the Bible, again, to understand reality. So now we have all these scientific arguments. Why do we need the Bible? So we're going to moving now from sort of cosmological origin to why we need the Bible, why that's essential. So it should be a good one.
Way home.